Thank you, Lauren. As Lauren mentioned, my name is Jessica McVary, and I'm also a planner with the Planning Department. I'm working with several of my colleagues on the Land Use Working Group, which is primarily focused on the Complete Communities category, as well as the Diverse and Adaptable Growth category, which is the focus of our chat this evening. Thanks to all of you for being here with us today. So some of you may be asking, what is Thrive Montgomery 2050? Well, Thrive Montgomery 2050 is an update to Montgomery County's general plan, which was last comprehensively updated in 1969. A general plan establishes a long-range vision for the county's growth. In fact, the Montgomery County that we know today, with its vibrant parks, quality schools, desirable urban, suburban, and rural communities, and the agricultural reserve, was shaped decades ago through the 1964 general plan. While the 1964 general plan has served our community well, the rapid social, environmental, technological, demographic, and economic shifts that we've experienced in the last several years, and which have been even more acutely recognized over the last several months, demonstrate that revisions are needed to guide Montgomery County's future growth. In the next slide, Thrive Montgomery 2050 envisions that in the year 2050, Montgomery County will be a vibrant and welcoming place where all people thrive, with equitable access to attainable housing, healthy food, opportunities for physical activity, parks and open space, employment, education, services, and a variety of travel options. No longer a suburban bedroom community, Montgomery County will have diversity in population, in living and working experiences, in modes of travel, and in natural and built resources. And people from all over the world will choose to live, work, and grow here. Next slide, please. Specifically in 2050, Montgomery County will be composed of a web of complete communities connected by vibrant corridors. Could you go to the next slide, please? Individual and unique centers of neighborhood activity will include a variety of housing types and price points. Housing will be located close to transit, workplaces, needed goods and services, public amenities, and active park spaces. These complete communities will be connected to the rest of the county by two types of corridors, multimodal transportation corridors, and green parks, stream valleys, and trails. And we'll talk a little bit more about the idea of corridors during our presentation and chat this evening. Next slide, please. Thrive Montgomery 2050 is organized into 8 categories, all of which contribute to the plan's strategic outcomes of economic health, environmental resilience, and community equity. And the focus of our chat today, as we've mentioned, is the diverse and adaptable growth category. Next slide, please. As the name implies, the diverse and adaptable growth category is really focused on how and where, excuse me, growth and development should occur over the next 30 years, and how this growth will be served by adequate, timely, and equitable public facilities and infrastructure. Montgomery County is mostly built out in terms of available land for new development. To accommodate population growth, new employment opportunities, and changing lifestyle preferences, we must continue to grow, but must do so in a way that's very different from how we've approached growth over the last several decades. We must transition from Greenfield development or the development of previously undeveloped land to infill development and redevelopment. Thrive 2050 seeks to focus growth on infill development and redevelopment, particularly in areas of the county that are supported by rail and bus rapid transit. Focusing new growth and redevelopment near transit and transit corridors allows the transformation of auto-centric places into people-centric places, and also allows the continued preservation of treasured resources in the county, such as parkland, environmentally sensitive areas, and the agricultural reserve. We will also talk a bit about the agricultural reserve today in this presentation and in our chat. And Thrive 2050 really continues to celebrate the agricultural reserve and its value in sustaining farming, farmland, and rural open space, as well as providing opportunities for local food production and carbon sequestration. So the diverse and adaptable growth category includes 4 goals supported by several policies and actions. And during our chat this evening, I'll present a summary of the goals and policies, but do encourage you to review the goals, policies, and actions in greater detail on our website, thrivemontgomery.com. I also believe that a link to the goals, policies, and actions will be shared in the chat for your reference. So with this introduction, I'll now provide a summary of the goals and policies. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the first goal of the diverse and adaptable growth category is to focus on infill development and redevelopment concentrated around rail and BRT. Next slide, please. This goal is supported by several policies which seek to provide additional detail on the priorities for infill development and redevelopment around rail and BRT. These policies include directing growth to areas supported by rail and BRT, as well as prioritizing the highest densities and redevelopment of underutilized properties near transit. With infill development and redevelopment, Thrive 2050 emphasizes the need to create new and enhance existing parks near transit as well. Next slide, please. The second goal in the diverse and adaptable growth category is to transform land uses surrounding rail and BRT corridors to accommodate future population growth and varied lifestyle preferences in attractive, walkable, and mixed-use communities. While the first goal in the category focused primarily on the location of growth, this goal and its supporting policies really focus on incentivizing development near transit, connecting transportation and green corridors across the county, and on the types of land uses desired near transit. Next slide, please. So these policies, in support of the second goal, really seek to incentivize development and public realm improvements near rail and BRT, to develop the county as an interconnected web of transportation and green corridors that are focused on pedestrians and bicyclists, that advance compact mixed-use development near rail and BRT, and also to retrofit single-use areas to accommodate higher densities and a mixture of uses within a 15-minute walk or bike ride of rail and BRT. So just to clarify a bit what is meant by single-use areas, this could mean, shopping centers that are near 15 minutes walking and biking of rail or BRT. It could mean institutional campuses. It could mean even, areas that are one type of housing today within 15 minutes of a walk or a bike ride of rail or BRT, really thinking about how we can retrofit single-use areas such as those that I mentioned to accommodate higher densities and a mixture of uses in close proximity to transit. Next slide, please. The third goal of the category is really an acknowledgement that the county must continue to grow, but really do so in a way that's different from how we've grown in the past. The goal states that we must manage future growth and development as a mature, built-out county by maximizing use of constrained land and identifying innovative solutions to deliver public facilities and infrastructure. So I'm just going to break this down a little bit to say that, over the last several decades, Montgomery County has focused a lot of our growth on what is called Greenfield development, or places where that had not previously been developed. And, as I mentioned earlier in the earlier slides, the county has started to really, we have very little undeveloped land left. And so beginning to shift from a county that focuses on greenfield development to one that focuses on infill development and redevelopment, and also thinks about how we can really think of creative and new ways to deliver public facilities and infrastructure from the ways that we have done so in the past. Next slide, please. So the policies that support this goal, they really seek to provide some additional specificity for how we manage growth and how we provide public infrastructure and services. And these policies include creating flexible and adaptable land use policies, programs, and regulations that allow for unanticipated changes in land use and development as technology, economy, climate change, and other factors create the need for quickly updating the county's regulatory mechanisms. So this policy is also a bit technical in nature. So I'd like to provide an example of what this might mean based on what we've seen in response to the pandemic over the last few months. For example, in the last several months, we've seen agencies work with local businesses and community to provide places for the community to walk, bike, and visit local businesses by closing streets or travel lanes to cars. And this has really been a flexible approach that is responding to an unanticipated situation. And this provides a bit of an example of the intent behind this first policy related to flexible and adaptable policies, programs, and regulations. The second policy in supporting this goal is developing new methods of funding public infrastructure by capturing increases in land value and reinvesting this value in public infrastructure. For example, in areas that are envisioned for growth, is there a mechanism that will allow some of the increased land value that results from higher densities to be reinvested in public infrastructure, such as transit or bus rapid transit? The third and fourth policies in support of this goal seek to leverage existing publicly owned land to provide public facilities and services and encourage the co-location of essential services such as schools, medical clinics, daycare centers, libraries, parks, and recreation centers, as well as expanding the use of public-private partnerships to achieve co-location of essential services with private development. If any of you are familiar with the recently opened Wheaton Recreation Center and Library, that provides a good example of a co-location that the county recently initiated. So that's really what is meant by co-location, this idea that we are locating public services and amenities together so that you can more easily access those services and amenities with sort of a one-stop mentality. So each of these policies is really aimed at how we can be smarter and how we can be more flexible in how we plan for, fund, and deliver public facilities and services. Next slide, please. We're definitely covering a lot of information here, some of which may be unfamiliar to you. So please don't hesitate to put your questions in a chat as they come up, rather than sort of holding them till the end. We'll definitely make sure that we go through the chat to capture any questions that you may have throughout the course of the presentation. So while the first three goals focused on where growth should occur and how we should manage growth, the fourth and final goal in the diverse and adaptable growth category focuses on how we can strengthen and support an area of the county where we intentionally chose to limit growth nearly 40 years ago, the county's agricultural reserve. The fourth goal is to strengthen Montgomery County's agricultural character to ensure the prosperity of the agricultural reserve into the future, to balance advancement in industry practices to enhance the agricultural reserve, and to sustain farmland, rural open space, and rural environmental resources to support the well-being of the entire county. This goal is supported by several policies, which are shown on the next slide, which aim to strengthen farming in the county. This first policy seeks to broaden access to healthy food, agritourism, and agricultural employment through the support and diversification of the agricultural sector, including identifying opportunities for adaptive reuse of underutilized land for farming in urban and suburban areas, really thinking about how we can broaden that access to healthy local food in our rural, suburban, and or urban areas. Next slide, please. The second policy seeks to maintain and enhance the agricultural reserve as a national model for supporting and protecting agriculture and rural open space. The Ag Reserve has numerous economic, environmental, and health benefits, particularly for a major metropolitan area. This policy emphasizes studying, monitoring, and promoting these benefits. Next slide, please. While celebrated nationally, many in Montgomery County are not aware that farming is an industry in the county or that healthy local foods are produced right here in the county. The next two policies seek to support new farmers as well as increase awareness of the benefits of the Ag Reserve and better connect communities throughout the county to this vital resource through public education and outreach, school programs, and fostering agritourism and ecotourism. Next slide, please. While Thrive Montgomery 2050 seeks to maintain and enhance the agricultural reserve, it also acknowledges that communities in the Ag Reserve require adequate infrastructure and services. These policies seek to provide communities with adequate infrastructure and services in a way that preserves the agricultural heritage and the unique character of the Ag Reserve, but also supports the needs of an evolving agricultural industry and practices, and reaffirms that agriculture should be the primary use in the Ag Reserve. Next slide, please. Thrive 2050 also seeks to acknowledge that the industry of farming has evolved since the establishment of the Ag Reserve in the 1980s. The final two policies of this goal are to balance support for this evolving agricultural industry with the conservation of farmland, rural open space, and environmental resources in the Ag Reserve, as well as to establish food production and distribution infrastructure to enable county growers to process their products locally and to reach residents through culinary, grocery, and wholesale outlets. This system will increase the competitiveness of farmers and reduce reliance on imported agricultural products and associated carbon emissions. So we have covered a lot here in the last 15 minutes or so, and I'm sure that you have some questions about the things that we've covered. And Lauren will be facilitating our chat this evening, and several colleagues will join in this evening that are representing several different working groups to help answer some questions that you may have, or really just engage in a dialogue. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren and say thanks again for being here.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. So I'm just going to go over a few rules just again, some reminders. So we're going to open it up for discussion. And again, you can feel free to type your questions in the chat or raise your hand. We may be asking you if you would be willing to share your question aloud. That's just because we like to see your face and see who's in the room. So let's just jump in. Our first question is from Jane. Jane, would you be willing to ask it aloud?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. And thanks for that overview. My question is just when will we get to see a map of where we want to see future growth, similar to the previous wedges and corridors maps? Thanks.
Thanks for that question. One of the things that we have been working on as a team over the last several weeks is thinking about the how these ideas will be displayed graphically, and we hope that that sort of graphic representation of the ideas will be included in the working draft that we anticipate would be available and presented to the planning board later this fall. I think that we're on track to have that working draft prepared and presented to the planning board in September. I think that on one of the early slides, I think it was slide 5, we showed a really sort of conceptual diagram of what we're thinking about when we talk about corridors, and really we're sort of building that idea off of the 2013 countywide transit corridors functional master plan that did identify future bus rapid transit corridors in the county. So sort of overlaying the 2013 BRT plan with existing Metro Rail, with the Purple Line, thinking about those elements of the transportation network is sort of where we're thinking about growth along corridors. Do any of my other colleagues want to weigh in or share thoughts on this?
Okay, hearing silence, I'll jump to the next question. So Jessica, thank you for that answer. And you discussed corridors a lot. And I just want to ask a pretty basic question, but what's a corridor and why does Thrive Montgomery 2050 focus on them?
I'll take a start at responding, and then I'll also invite Jesse Cohn from the Transportation Working Group and Steve Finley from the Environmental Working Group to help weigh in as well. We've really thought about corridors in two ways through this plan. One, multimodal transportation corridors that really are sort of those major highways, those major roadways that we see today that do in the 2013 countywide transit corridors plan envision supporting future bus rapid transit. We also think of Metro Rail and the Purple Line as corridors, but we also think of natural corridors or green corridors, stream valleys, and parkways, sort of thinking about how those sort of different pieces of the natural and built infrastructure come together. And so that's sort of how we're thinking about corridors in Thrive 2050. But I'd certainly love to hear from Jesse or Steve if they have anything further they'd want to add on that.
Sure, I can just, this is Jesse, reiterate a little bit of what you said and expand on it. A lot of our roadways throughout the county have really been built for cars and not for other modes. And so, Jane, I know you were part of the transportation conversation, and many of the other goals here, or I guess chapters of the plan, really focus on corridors and how we can transform our formerly auto-focused corridors into being really multimodal. And so when we talk about that, we definitely talk about transit, as Jess was saying, but also how we can make these corridors better for walking and biking so that there are safe and comfortable ways for travelers to get to that transit or to walk or bike to their destinations.
Awesome.
Sure, and I'll be happy.
Go ahead, Steve. I'm sorry.
I'll be happy to share a bit about the green corridors. One of the things that was really interesting as the working groups were getting together and working together was kind of the realization that we have these transportation corridors focused along some of our major roadways, I-270 and 355, and Connecticut Avenue in Georgia and New Hampshire and so forth. And that those tended to go kind of north-south and northwest, southeast, but that then they tended to intersect with our green corridors that ran primarily along stream valleys. And a lot of those are running somewhere between north-south and northeast to southwest. So they're, kind of intersecting at where the transportation corridors cross these natural corridors. And the first thing that we wanted to make sure that we did in the plan was make sure that we preserve the natural corridors for all of the environmental benefits that they provide for protecting our water quality, protecting the water quality in the streams, the water supply that we have, the wildlife travel corridors, all of the carbon sequestration and other important environmental benefits are being provided by those. But with these intersections with the transportation corridors, we also recognize that a lot of those natural corridors, green corridors, have in them greenways and greenway trails and things like that we would like to be able to get people to so that they can appreciate and enjoy the natural corridors, so that they can get healthful exercise and be able to get away from the hustle and bustle of life. So it's this kind of mesh intersection of transportation corridors and green corridors that we want to recognize and take advantage of opportunities that it provides us to both protect the natural resources that we want to protect, but also to be able to allow people to engage with them in appropriate ways where we have trails and so forth. So that's a neat intersection that we're hoping to be able to focus on in the future.
Awesome. Thank you for that response. I'm going to go ahead and shift gears a little bit and direct this question to our housing planner, Lisa Cavoni. So this question is, how can you ensure that the housing built near transit stations will be affordable and attainable?
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. I think that's a great question, and it really intersects well between our two chapters where we talk about diverse and adaptable growth, and mine, which is attainable and affordable housing. And I think the biggest thing that we could do is to build more housing and more places of more types. And what that means is when Jessica talked about these BRT lines, these corridors, what we envision for them in terms of complete communities, that means different types of housing. That means in areas where around these corridors where you could only build single family homes, right now single family detached homes, we're talking about maybe building a duplex or a triplex. It's really about diversifying the housing type in order to create more supply, to create downward pressure on the market. So it's a little bit of zoning, it's a little bit of market, and it's a lot of bit of building more housing.
Great, thank you for that. Now we're going to switch gears again and go back to Jessica. You mentioned kind of a shift from Greenfield development to Infill, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what those terms mean and why one is better for us as we're kind of moving towards the future than the other.
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. So as I mentioned briefly, Greenfield development is really this idea that you are building new communities, new housing, new commercial uses, that you're building on land that was previously undeveloped. So that might mean farmland, it might mean vacant land, and really our county over the sort of course of its growth has really been a county that has grown by spreading out, by developing properties or parcels or areas of land that were previously undeveloped. But as I mentioned briefly, we've reached a point where most of our land is sort of taken, for lack of a better term. So that means that the land today is either built, it has something on it, or it means that it's parkland, environmentally protected land. So that might mean a stream valley or a steep slope, or it's in the agricultural reserve, or it's in an area that's protected by easements or other legal mechanisms. And so really this notion of shifting from greenfield development to infill or redevelopment, particularly focused on areas around transit, means that we are sort of no longer focused on developing undeveloped properties, but rather thinking about how we can redevelop properties that were already developed previously. And also, the idea of infill development is one that thinks about if there, is a parking lot or an underutilized piece of land, is there an opportunity for us to look at how we could redevelop that property? That's infill development, is this idea of sort of filling in the gap or filling in the teeth, if you will.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you for that response. I'm going to head next to Tom Grant, who has a question. Tom, are you willing to, I think you need to maybe unmute yourself. Oh, there we go. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just curious, where does the Corridor Cities Transitway project stand, both in terms of what kind of mode of transportation and a timeline? You have a lot of up-county housing in terms of Germantown and Clarksburg, and improving access for those people to jobs in the Rockville, Bethesda area.
So this is Jessie. I can answer that question. So we're currently kind of kicking off a project called Corridor Forward, looking at different transit opportunities along the I-270 corridor. And the CCT is one of the different transit options that we're looking at. So as part of that project, we're going to be identifying what modes or what transit opportunities we want to prioritize in the years going forward. And so if you want to be involved in that project, we can add a link to the chat to our webpage. We're planning to have a formal kickoff in September with a public meeting, but there will be kind of intermittent information posted between now and then as well, if you want to stay engaged. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessie. So next we're going to head to Jane, who has another question.
Hi, I feel like maybe I missed it when reading through the policies and actions, but I was wondering, does this chapter talk about directly the SSP or the county growth policy at all? I feel like that's something that would make sense to talk about in this chapter, but I don't really remember seeing it discussed. Thank you.
So I'll start and then can ask my colleague Lisa to weigh in as well. So as you may know, the county's growth policy is currently being updated. And the diverse and adaptable growth chapter does not specifically reference the county growth policy or the subdivision staging policy by name. But the third goal of the diverse and adaptable growth category is where we really talk about really thinking about how we approach growth, thinking about new tools and strategies. The county growth policy or the subdivision staging policy is something that's updated every 4 years. And this is really a long-range vision, a long-range plan. And we really wanted to think about how we could approach growth as a mature county while providing sort of flexible and adaptable and sort of nimble suggestions for the future. So we don't specifically reference the SSP or the county growth policy, but the notion of making sure that we have adequate public facilities and infrastructure is included in the third goal of this category. I'll turn it over to Lisa, though, to add any more specifics regarding the SSP.
Sure. Like just said, the general plan is a 30-year document that is supposed to be a little bit higher level. As we know, the SSP, or county growth policy, it's a very technical document that has also changed its name. I think this is its third name in the past 10 years, went from county growth policy to SSP, back to growth policy. So we really wanted to stay away from specifically calling out the policy. But I will say that, Jess and I worked very closely. Jess was a big part of our ULI TAP to making sure that the goals of the general plan for diverse and adaptable growth are present in the subdivision staging policy. And that was something that ULI mentioned, to really link these two policies to make sure that the policy guidance and context in the county growth policy, or SSP, is present in our general plan. And I do think we succeeded in that.
Great answers. So I'm going to shift again a little bit to the ag reserve, which we talked about, and those policies are in this chapter. So can you talk a little bit about how this plan strengthens the agricultural reserve?
Sure. So I'll get started and also, ask my colleague Steve Finley to weigh in as well. So Thrive Montgomery 2050 really seeks to reaffirm the importance of retaining the agricultural reserve and celebrating its value as a tool both to sustain farmland and rural open space, as well as an opportunity to support that evolving agricultural industry that I mentioned earlier. In addition to providing an area of contiguous farmland to support the agricultural industry, the Ag Reserve also provides numerous environmental benefits, as well as opportunities for local food production and carbon sequestration. So the Thrive 2050 plan really acknowledges this value and seeks to include policies and actions that can help to support the agricultural reserve for the next 30 years. Steve, do you want to add on anything from an environmental perspective?
Sure. One of the really interesting things about the agricultural reserve is that it was originally created as an outgrowth of one of our earlier general plans. And the fact that it was preserved and protected as an agriculture and open space area focused on the agriculture industry and heritage of Montgomery County means that it's available for us to continue to have as a resource today. But what we're learning right now is that especially with what we're learning about climate change, we are finding out that the value of the agricultural reserve largely as it exists, but with some enhancements and some attention paid to all of the benefits that it provides to us, are putting us, having that agricultural reserve puts us in a much better position as a jurisdiction to become more resilient in the face of the changes that climate change is bringing. Among other things, we're anticipating, larger storms with greater rainfalls. We need to have areas that are permeable, that can absorb and slow some of the runoff and ameliorate some of the flooding, that can protect water supplies that may become a little bit more dicey as we experience alternate periods of drought and a lot of rain. We have the great, the Little Seneca Lake is an emergency water supply that is in the middle of the Ag Reserve area. And so that's all protected by that Ag Reserve area around it. The need to sequester carbon is bolstered by the large areas that are still forested or are covered with other vegetation. And with advancements in agricultural practices, some of those can make farming and farmland even more fertile to produce food, while also sequestering additional carbon, which is beneficial. And finally, we anticipate that there may be disruptions, including in the food supply in the future because of climate change. And so the ability to grow some portion of our own food needs locally is something that is, if you'll forgive me for saying so, of growing importance. There are a number of reasons why the Ag Reserve and the possibilities that it brings us for both environmental benefits, resilience, and potential greater economic benefits are all, we're really excited to be able to have that resource, to be able to take advantage of it and enhance it for those benefits in the future.
Great, thank you for that. Next, I'm going to head back to Jane because I saw she just typed a question. Do you want to go ahead and ask it, Jane?
Sure, and I'm eating dinner now, which is why I took my video off.
All good, all good.
But this is a little bit more of a technical specific question. I know that land value tax or land value capture is something that's mentioned in this chapter and in other chapters throughout Thrive, or at least for the policies and actions. And I was wondering if a land value tax would be considered a property tax, and if so, like, would it then be subject to the charter amendments about increasing property taxes? Thank you.
I'll go in and jump in and take this one. Yes, it would be subject. You would have to change the charter. We'd have to work with the state. It would be a very complicated process, but we felt that it's important in a 30-year plan that we start thinking about how we look at all of these things differently, and that includes progressive tax structures. But yes, it will be quite the challenge if we decide to pursue this recommendation.
Great, thank you for that, Lisa and Jane. So just to head back to the Ag Reserve a little bit, you discussed, Jessica, the need to support an evolving agricultural industry. And I'm wondering what kinds of agricultural products are currently produced in the Ag Reserve, and how will this plan lead to a change in production? Or do you, anticipate there being a change in production resulting from this plan?
Thanks for that question. So, it's interesting because the Ag Reserve has certainly evolved over the last several decades. And, we traditionally, sort of in the 1960s, for example, saw a lot more, farming of sort of animals, dairy, beef, that type of farming. And over time, while there are still farms that have, animals and raise animals and those sorts of things, it's really sort of evolved to be more of a crop or a commodity farming industry. However, we are starting to see some shift with that. And last year, Montgomery Planning released an agritourism study that might be a place to take a look at for more information on the evolution of the ag reserve over the last several decades. But we're starting to see more table food production in the ag reserve, and we're also starting to see more agritourism and farm alcohol production, for example. And it's been interesting as we've talked to some of the farmers in the ag reserve today. They've talked a little bit about what kind of incentives could we think about in the future to encourage some of the folks that are doing more of the commodity farming. How could we really encourage them to start to shift to farming more table crops and more local food so that we can provide and produce and distribute food locally? And that is one of the things that we've really thought a lot about in the Diverse and Adaptable Growth chapter, and particularly in the policies related to goal number 4.
Great, thank you for that. So just to get back to this idea of transit corridors a little bit, a lot of the county won't be served directly by rail or bus rapid transit. Will these areas be more or less left alone, or is there a plan to link these other areas to transit corridors and connect them?
This is Jessie. I can answer that question if you want. Yeah, the transportation chapter of the general plan talks a bit about how we will connect people to our transit corridors. So some of our transit facilities already have parking, and that will continue at some of the really high capacity transit stations like Shady Grove. Also, there will be local bus service that can connect people who are in less dense parts of the county to our premium transit corridors. And then finally, we continue to work on improving bicycle and pedestrian connections for those who are within close enough proximity to walk or bike to transit.
Great, thank you. So another question about growth. Will this Thrive 2050 plan directly change the amount of growth allowed in the county? What tools are at Montgomery County's disposal to guide growth to the places where we want it to occur?
Well, I can start with that one. So basically, the Thrive 2050 plan, it proposes a lot of tools. And it thinks a little bit about, while there aren't zoning changes proposed as part of the plan, the Thrive 2050 will really serve as a guide for master plans, subsequent master plans and neighborhood plans that do change zoning, which will have an impact on where growth is and isn't allowed. Additionally, the plan proposes that we leverage existing publicly owned land to provide public facilities and services where needed, and that we expand the use of public-private partnerships to achieve co-location of essential services with private development. So that gives you just a bit of an idea of some of the tools that we would use to guide growth.
Great, thank you. So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. I have a few closing remarks. I'm just going to share my screen once again. Give me one moment. Here we go. Uh-oh. Hold on one second. There we go. Okay, so I just want to kind of update you on where we are in the process. And, first and foremost, thank everyone for participating today and thanking all of the staff members who we had join the call. So just where we are in the project timeline, we recently presented the draft policies and actions to the planning board on June 11th. You can see that full staff report on our website and also watch that presentation. And next step is the working draft plan. So that's really what we're working towards right now, and that will be in September 2020. There will be opportunities for public hearing and public testimony, so please stay tuned for that. And one way to kind of make sure you're in the know is to sign up for our e-letter, which you can sign up for at www.thrivemontgomery.com. You can also send any comments or questions you have to thrive2050@montgomeryplanning.org. That's our email address. And feel free to connect with us on social media. As you know, Lisa is kind of our Twitter star, but we love answering questions. So feel free to talk to us there. And then this, is our final community chat, but all of these have been recorded and are on our website. So if you missed any and you want to catch up, feel free to check those out. And stay tuned. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great night.
Thank you so much. Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.